Parable of the Hats by Jon B. Albertson. Copyright, all rights reserved. Written January 2025. All music performed and recorded by Jon B. Albertson. Smile by Charlie Chaplin, 1936. And You Took Advantage of Me by Rodgers and Hart, 1928. In any city USA, it had become the style to wear a hat. Now there were many good reasons one might choose to wear said chapeau, besides style. Sometimes it rained, and people who wore spectacles found it difficult to see with rain on their glasses. Sometimes it was sunny, and doctors told men who were victims of male pattern baldness that they needed to cover their heads to reduce their likelihood of contracting skin cancer. Sometimes, at the ball games that were popular in the city, the brim or bill of a hat prevented the sun from blinding players who needed to see the ball, or the spectators from witnessing play that might arm their arsenal of umpire criticism. Pretty much everybody agreed that hats were a good idea. The haberdashers, however, each grew hungry for their corner of the hat market. Enough so that they organized a meeting that brought competing haberdashers together. The 13 business owners met in the back room of a popular pub called The Capitol. In no time, they had ingested enough beer to fuel their criticism of each competing hat style, when, over all the pointing fingers and yelling, a couple of the more successful business owners who had been conversing quietly in a smoky, shadowed corner projected their voices loudly enough to quiet the rest of the room. "We've had a proposal that might benefit all of us," said a bespectacled and bearded man in a plaid scally cap. An elaborately mustachioed man wearing a 10-gallon cowboy hat followed with, "That's right. Maybe instead of trying to destroy each other's businesses, we can create a sort of mutually beneficial competition." A wave of theatrical murmur ebbed and waned through the room. "If we can connect ideas to each style of hat through our advertising, assigning it a rightness or wrongness—" "Maybe not so much a rightness or wrongness," Scally interrupted 10-gallon, "but say a blueness or redness to our hats." One of the other haberdashers raised their hand like a schoolboy. "Yes, you in the ball cap." "But it's not an issue of right or wrong. It's just about what our customers like." "Exactly," exclaimed Scally. "We want them to keep liking. But we also want them to insist that their hat preference is correct." "Which by default means if you don't like my ball caps, you're wrong?" "Well," 10-gallon knocked the ash off of his cigar before it fell on the floor, and as he rolled it gently in the ashtray, bringing the ash to a delicate point, continued, "Not exactly. You see, it's not that any of our hats are right or wrong." "Red or blue," interrupted Scally. "Red or blue," 10-gallon repeated, clearing his throat, and sipped and puffed his cigar. "It's that they will think some hats are right and some are wrong." There was silence. and confused looks on people's faces. "You see," said Scally, in what could only be described as a high school economics teacher's voice, "all we will actually be selling them is the idea that their opinion is the correct opinion." "And who wouldn't buy that?" boomed 10 Gallon. "But don't they already own their opinion?" queried Ballcap. "We would sell them the idea that the mere existence of a hat that's different is a threat to their preferred hat," continued Scally, half convincing himself. "But how will this help us?" asked a stylishly dressed man wearing a pork pie that sported an opalescent peacock herl. "And how is a different hat any threat to ours?" interjected Ballcap, but nobody regarded him. 10 Gallon puffed on his cigar and sat slowly, carefully, in a rocking chair, rubbing his knee, which appeared to be sore. "How many toppable heads do you think there are in any city?" A lady wearing a transparent green visor answered definitively, 348,082. All heads turned to her, wide-eyed. She cowered a bit and continued sheepishly, "Voting aged adults at the end of last year's census." "Well, I for one won't question the visor," 10 Gallon nodded. Scally continued, "And how many hats does each of us need to sell for our business to be sustainable?" Again, a wave of murmurs went through the room. Within less than a minute, it had died down, and everyone was looking at Ms. Visor, who had been quietly looking at the ground and subtly swaying back and forth, grinding the ball of her left foot into the floor. "Visor?" 10 Gallon and Scally asked in what sounded like rehearsed unison. She sheepishly looked through her visor, slowly lifted her head, then looked about the room. "Roughly 1,500. The other haberdashers looked up at the ceiling, visibly counting their fingers and toes, tightening and loosening their lips, blinking, squinting, and finally nodding with calculated frowns. "Of course," Visor continued, "your profits would have to take into consideration your shop's overhead, which would vary based on what street it's on, the square footage, your number of employees, the cost of materials." "Thank you, Ms. Visor." Scally stepped over to her, placing his hand on her shoulder. "You've made our point." Visor started to cower awkwardly into the shadows again, but Scally stopped her with a question. "So, Ms. Visor, if we, all 13 of us, could persuade each of these heads to purchase just one hat," you could already see the numbers crunching in her head, "how many hats would each of our shops sell if each voting citizen purchased one hat?" Visor was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving quickly, blinking, briefly glancing up at the beams in the ceiling. 26,775. Scally patted her on the shoulder. "And a half," she concluded under her breath, her tone seeking approval. You could have heard a pin drop, but only their jaws did. "Mr. Pork Pie," 10 Gallon gravelled through his cigar smoke, "do you have the infrastructure to sell 26,000... Visor swallowed the last word. "I stand corrected. Thank you, Visor. 26,000 and change hats next year." Pork Pie shook his head. "But wouldn't it be nice," 10 Gallon stood up, "to sell, say, 3,000? Even 2,500? Scally chimed in. "Wouldn't that be a nice problem to solve?" A man with his eyes shadowed behind a fedora's brim spoke from the back of the room. "So what do we do to get this started?" 10 Gallon stepped under the chandelier in the center of the room, his hat brim casting shadows that put fedoras to shame. "That's the question, isn't it?" Scally, standing in a circle of 13 that had now surrounded 10 Gallon, put his hands on the shoulders of the haberdashers who stood on either side of him and spoke. "Mr. 10 Gallon here lives on the outskirts of town, on his ranch, In fact, it seems a lot of the people who live outside of town running farms or ranches wear hats like his. But they like my hats too, chimed in Ballcap. Again, nobody paid attention to him. Well, of course they do, Mr. Fedora chimed in. That 10-gallon hat keeps the rain from running down their backs when they're out in the field and keeps the sun out of their eyes. And hell, maybe his steer wouldn't recognize him if he was wearing my hat. So he wears the right hat, said Scally enthusiastically. But that doesn't make your hat wrong, chimed in Porkpie. But my hat certainly wouldn't be right for 10-gallon, now would it? Everybody shrugged and nodded. But Scally here, 10-gallon stepped towards Scally, placing his arm around him and bringing him to the middle of the circle. Scally drives everywhere he goes. Everybody, including Scally, nodded in agreement. Now, have you ever tried to drive a car like Scally's SUV with a hat like mine on? People squinted, attempting to imagine. The top would scrape the ceiling, and you can't put your head back far enough to look up at a traffic light. The damn headrest is in the way. You mean your damn hat would be in the way, retorted Scally. 10-gallon and Scally fist bumped. People nodded in agreement. 10-gallon continued. A hat like mine would be unsafe. He could take the damn hat off and put it in the passenger seat, muttered Ballcap, under all the hubbub. Miss Visor raised her hand. Yes, Visor? He could take it off and put it in the passenger seat. 10-gallon sighed heavily and threw his hands in the air. How many hats do you want to sell? Scally reached up to put his hand on 10-gallon's shoulder, but the big man had shuffled back to his rocking chair, shaking his head. Here's the point. Scally put his hands together. If we can sell people the idea that their use of a hat is the correct use, they will always wear the hat that matches their idea. They'll buy one to match each of their outfits and each of their ideas. Porkpie raised his hand. Mr. Porkpie, what if I wear different hats for different purposes? Scally leaned in just a little bit closer to Porkpie, removed his own Scally hat, reached it out to Porkpie, gently removing Porkpie's hat and switching them. Then I guess you'll just have to buy more hats. He shook Porkpie's hand and switched hats back again. You see, came the smoke and gravel from the rocking chair in the corner, we will be shifting our business from selling hats to selling ideas. We'll plaster billboards with ads connecting hats, lauding the practicality and elegance of one hat or the idiocy of another, and on the next street, a billboard that says the opposite. But how many hats does a person need? Miss Visor's voice carried a little more conviction than usual, a firm statement, even though it was technically a question. Scally folded his hands and looked at the floor briefly, measuring his words. One more than they currently have, if we can convince them that our hat fits what they believe is right. The ice rang against Fedora's glass as he swirled the last of his drink. But I thought the one they had was the right one. Porkpie answered, in an epiphany, different hats for different purposes. Precisely. We're selling them purposes, came the gravel and smoke from 10-gallon. The murmur in the room became more animated. So it's not about the hats anymore, calculated Ms. Visor, but about their preferences being correct. And by default, preferences other than theirs are wrong, Fedora calculated. Must be wrong, concluded Scally, his arm around Porkpie again. Years later, families in any town USA were divided down hat lines. Every building was plastered with hat praises and insults. Wire-framed signs filled people's yards with chapeau persuasions. Churches only allowed certain types of hats to enter their doors. Schools forbade hats either in buildings or on school buses in order to prevent fights from breaking out. Arguments festered in the local news about whether a headband or a hair clip qualified as a hat and whether they should be allowed in school. The shape of protective headgear on the job site and in surgeries was strictly regulated so as to prevent counterproductive contention. People were fired, hired, fed, and starved based on the type of hat that they wore. Some went hungry in order to buy their next hat. They downsized their houses to increase their hat budget. Neighbors built taller fences when their neighbors wore hats that served a different purpose than theirs and snuck into the neighbors' yards at night to paint insulting graffiti on the neighbor's side of the fence about their hat choice. The choicest insults were all related to chapeau styles. At holiday get-togethers, hats had to be left in your car before entering the host home, and no conversations about hats were allowed. Grandchildren refused to talk to grandparents and vice versa because of the hats they wore. The 13 haberdashers, however, became the wealthiest people in town. In public, they pretended to hate each other, while they continued to meet in secret at the Capitol, where they padded each other's pockets with lavish gifts. And any time an entrepreneur tried to open a store featuring a completely new style of chapeau, one that served an entirely different function, the 13 devised every possible means to denigrate the significance of that hat and its purpose, in order to cling to their share of the very lucrative market, which they had invented in order to sell citizens ideas that they already owned. According to Ms. Weiser, the average citizen of voting age in any town USA had in their possession, 10 years after the inception of HI, the Haberdashers Initiative, an average of 82.3333 ad infinitum hats, exactly one less than they thought they needed.